welcome to Silverstone Technology Cluster's Ask the Expert podcast. I'm your host, Jeannie. This episode is proudly brought to you by TC Group, and today I'm here at TC Group. I'm joined by Felix Medd, who is here to talk to us a little bit about R&D tax credits. So before we get started, Felix, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much.
And can you tell us all a little bit about yourself and how you got to your current role here at TC Group?
Yeah, certainly. So actually at university I originally studied Latin and Ancient Greek, which I realise is probably a bit of a departure from what was expected, but actually for a career that ended up spending a lot of time reading and interpreting legislation, which is so important in R&D and tax more widely, I think the sort of rules and logic-based language of the Latinists probably set me up quite nicely for that. After I graduated, I then went into mergers and acquisitions for a brief period, working in an office in London and then latterly in Hong Kong. And when I got back to the UK, I wanted to pursue something else that was quite client management focused, and I found that the client-facing elements of R&D tax credit relief was really appealing to me. Since that time, I've worked in startup companies, large companies, and small owner-managed businesses, both on the accountancy side as well as on the independent advisory side. So I've probably seen a good sample of the length and breadth of R&D since I started my career. And then just before joining TC Group, I specialised in R&D inquiry defence at one of the large firms based in London, which is obviously a very topical matter at the moment.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't aware, can you give us just a little bit of an introduction to R&D tax credits and what they are?
Sure, so I think elevator pitch, because many people will be aware of it, but at a very brief level, R&D is a form of relief that companies can seek if they are the four key criteria are seeking to advance scientific knowledge or technological capability, overcoming some degree of technological uncertainties. If that's sort of contextualized against a baseline of what other companies in the industry are doing, and if the projects are led by a competent professional. In short, if companies are doing innovative work in whatever sector they operate in, then they may be entitled to a form of tax relief, and there are various qualifying costs they can total up in order to minimize their corporation tax, or if they are loss-making, to look for a cash injection at key points in their lifespan.
Okay, so today you're going to tell us a little bit about the pitfalls of R&D. Can you tell me what your number one is?
Yeah, certainly. I think still the most common pitfall when I look at work in the industry more widely is a lack of an appropriate baseline. This is a really easy one to fall into because a lot of the time companies will get caught up talking about what they've sought to advance, what the problems they've encountered were. What they don't understand is if you don't contextualize that advance against the baseline of what the rest of the industry is doing, HMRC, when they analyze your report, are never going to know whether or not that advance is specific to your company, you've just advanced your own state of knowledge, or if this is actually something that is relevant to the wider industry. So number one for me always, and it may be a simple one, but it's nonetheless critical, is you have to contextualize it. Give a snapshot of what the rest of the industry's knowledge is, what their capability is, and why what you are seeking to do differs. And there are a couple of asterisks I'll just throw in there, because if there's one or two companies out there that are doing something particularly clever, but it's a trade secret, no one else knows how it's done, work to reach that same point can still be considered an advance, but you need to make sure that's overtly stated. Don't let HMRC find that out after the fact.
Okay, so it sounds like it's important that you use specific terminology and make sure that all the qualifying criteria are met.
That's absolutely true. And this is all very clearly set out in the underlying legislation, but I think there's another facet to that as well, which is that while the legislation will set out the core criteria, nowadays in the context of an increased number of compliance checks by HMRC, it's also important to understand what sort of questions may be asked if HMRC wants further information. And that's where having an advisor with demonstrated inquiry and compliance defence experience comes in. So anyone reading the legislation will know that, for example, an advance and uncertainty needs to be stated. What might be less well known, though, is things like a clear timeline, multi-stage timeline indicating when uncertainties were encountered, how they were overcome, is really critical to show that you were undertaking relevant qualifying activity throughout the period and not just at certain points. This isn't mentioned explicitly in the legislation, but it is always queried if HMRC open a compliance check. And really a good advisor should be anticipating that and providing as much information at the forefront rather than waiting for HMRC to ask further questions.
Okay, so it sounds like the technical and legislative definitions are just as important as the actual calculations themselves when it comes to R&D.
That's absolutely true. And look, the calculations are absolutely critical, right? It's important that any costs that are claimed for, you've got corresponding invoices for, that you've got payroll data that can back these things up. I would say the advantage on the calculation side is that it's a lot more, there's been a lot more clarity provided about what's qualifying and what's not. And for the most part, while we're talking about the sort of pitfalls companies can encounter, they will mostly fall on the legislative side simply because there's some degree of interpretation that's needed and knowledge of HMRC's tendencies. Whereas calculations tend to be a little bit simpler, right? You know, if a staff member's undertaking qualifying activity and you've got payroll, employers' national insurance contributions listed, then with either timesheet data or reasonable apportionments, you know that cost is eligible. Whereas how one quantifies in advance, while it is clearly mapped out, is definitely slightly more grey.
Okay, so you've mentioned inquiries or compliance checks a little bit. Is it something that companies need to be concerned about? Is it prohibitive to claiming the tax credits, the R&D tax credits? What are we talking about there?
Yeah, I think this is a really relevant thing to raise now because any business owner, any company needs to be considering the risk versus reward factors in anything that they are doing. And for a bit of background for those who aren't aware, since roughly 2021, compliance checks into R&D relief skyrocketed. They went from, in the SME R&D scheme, single-digit percentage inquiry checks to, in I think mid-22, according to HMRC statistics, 25% of all SME R&D claims were challenged. Now, to be clear, that's returned a little bit more towards the norm now, but even so, it's important that companies who are considering making a claim recognize there's an attendant risk there and take steps in advance in order to mitigate that risk. So, in short, look, R&D is and will likely always be one of the most valuable forms of tax relief that a company can seek. However, with the risk of compliance checks now, you really need to make sure you're taking certain steps to avoid, or to minimize it, I would say.
Okay, so you've talked about finding the baseline and you've talked about the risk of not having the correct expertise or the correct advice to submit a claim. What are the other pitfalls that you can talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the ones that's very topical at the moment will be what HMRC would deem subcontracted R&D. And this is topical because it's actually changing with the implementation of the merge scheme. So without opening up the full classroom, so to speak, a little bit of background on this is that under the SME R&D scheme, you can claim for, one of the costs would be your subcontractors. So if I subcontract work to another company and that's R&D related, I may well be able to claim for it. However, if work is subcontracted to you, by extent, you then cannot claim it because HMRC will not allow any work to be sort of double claimed. Without going too much into detail, under the large company scheme, in some cases, subcontractors can claim for relief. And this has caused a little bit of confusion, particularly in areas such as the construction industry, where large companies are doing some really interesting work around, foundational raft stabilization and the like. But the sort of history here is that a lot of companies were claiming subcontracted R&D when they shouldn't have been, or when they should only have been claiming it under the less generous large company scheme. HMRC attempted to clarify this, I suppose, by saying that under the merge scheme, there aren't any such limitations about what size of company can or can't claim subcontracted R&D. But they did then kind of confuse the matter, as is their wont, I suppose, by saying that now when R&D is contracted, there are several kind of tests that they're going to look at to see who owns it. This includes, does it say in the contract, does one entity own the R&D? Who's taking the financial risk? Who is going to keep the IP? They haven't, as is their wont, actually told us which are the most important factors. So now looking forward to claims ending in the year ending 2025, companies really need to make sure they're working with an advisor to work out if they're doing work under contract, are they eligible? Have they taken measures to record things like keeping the IP, financial risk? Are there clauses in the contract in order to defend their right to claim that portion of the claim? Because now large companies who previously wouldn't have been able to look at that work may now not start to look to claim that subcontracted work as part of their own R&D efforts. I realise that's a bit, after promising that I wasn't going to take us into the classroom, I probably went a bit deep there, but obviously if anyone's interested I can provide some clarity down the line. It's just important, if you're doing work under contract, make sure you're checking under the new merge scheme, are you still going to be eligible, and have you taken steps to kind of defend that right to claim it?
It sounds like it's a great opportunity to get some tax relief, but there seems to be a lot of legislation, a lot of things that need to be understood, and I guess that's where it comes in handy to have an advisor.
I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the key sort of challenges to the scheme nowadays is that because for so long the enforcement was so lax, that I think the industry probably built up some quite bad habits. And then people got used to the idea that you could seek this very beneficial form of tax relief without doing the attendant, I suppose, compliance work and preparation. Now, with the time taken to compile an R&D claim nowadays, yes, it has gone up, but in most instances, it is still well worth companies' time doing so, provided they do it the right way. So you're absolutely right.
And have you got any final thoughts to add on R&D for us?
I think there's one final area that companies probably need to be aware of, which is, again, a hangover from what we just talked about. And that's sitting in this idea that if you are conservative in your estimations, or if you are engaged in an area or in an industry where R&D obviously takes place, that is sufficient to defend your right for a claim. And I've seen this now on numerous occasions where companies, potentially with R&D in the name, or in very, very key precision engineering roles have sort of gone, well, it's obvious we do R&D, to which I would agree, but their takeaway has then been, okay, well, we therefore don't need to be as cautious in our compilation and submission of the claim because it's obvious we do R&D. And I can't emphasize enough, that's not the outlook that HMRC will take. They will say it's great that you're obviously doing R&D, but you haven't met the criteria as set out in the BEIS guidelines to show that this work you're claiming for is eligible. And I have seen personally them open inquiries into clients that have latterly come to me for compliance advice where that exact situation has happened. They are clearly doing R&D work, but they haven't necessarily met those criteria. So that's one. And I think two is the sort of attendant pitfall is I've also seen companies say, well, we always claim less than we know we're entitled to. So HMRC will really know that we've been reasonable and they're less likely to open a compliance check. I can tell you from bitter experience that won't even factor in. If HMRC feel that the technical criteria haven't been met, they will look to open a compliance check, and the defence of, we've been really reasonable in our cost allocations won't even be considered, and the inspectors will say as much. Once again, doesn't mean it's not worth investigating, but it does mean that, as you alluded to, I think seeking expert advice is absolutely the correct move when seeking R&D relief.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that, Felix. You got through the whole thing without speaking Latin, so...
Yeah, that's an optional extra if anyone's looking for an R&D claim, maybe in the Vatican, let me know.
Yeah, Felix's services are always available. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. It's been insightful, it's been interesting.
Pleasure, thank you for having me.
And thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe so that you get updates on future episodes, and take care.